Hi, I'm Brian Nash, and I'm back for season 2 of How We Got Here. After a long hiatus, I'm back after summer and fall, and as we begin to head into winter, talk about Atlantic Canadian, our ancestors, our history, our communities. Going to be doing a few things different and a few things the same this year, and starting off this week, I'm going to be doing something the same. I've had him on the show before, Brian McConnell. He's a retired lawyer, a genealogist, and author. I'm going to be talking about his latest book, Loyal and True, which is about the Loyal Orange Lodge in Torbrook, Nova Scotia, which is in Annapolis County. Brian is a great friend of the podcast. He's been on a few times, and I had a really good, interesting discussion with him about this book, about the Orange Lodge in general, and the role they played in many communities in Atlantic Canada. The Orange Lodge, if you don't know much about it, we've had 4 Prime Ministers of Canada. The last Prime Minister of Canada to be a member of the Orange Lodge was Beef the Chief, John Beef and Baker. So let's get started with episode 1 of season 2.
Welcome to How We Got Here, a genealogy podcast hosted by Brian Nash, exploring the tools, tips, and resources for genealogists from Atlantic Canada and family historians from around the globe who are researching their ancestors from Atlantic Canada. Every family has a story, so stick around as Brian and his guests share the unique family stories that help shape the history and culture of Atlantic Canada.
I'd like to welcome my guest once again, Brian McConnell, and today we're going to be talking about a book he wrote about the Orange Lodge in Torbrook, Nova Scotia, and just the Orange Lodge in general. Going to talk a little bit about the history of it in Atlantic Canada, and what type of information we can find out about our family, about our community's histories through the Orange Lodge, and how they were actually part of a very active part of many communities in Atlantic Canada. So thanks for coming on, Brian. I do appreciate it. I always do. I enjoy having you. I enjoy talking with you every time. So do you want to just give a little bit of introduction, a little maybe about the Orange Lodge, and even sort of how it came to Atlantic Canada?
Sure, Brian. I'm always happy to speak on historical subjects of particular interest to me. And full disclosure, with the Orange Lodge, my grandfather was a member in Ireland, and then when they immigrated to Canada, he was a member in Toronto. In doing genealogy and family research on my mother's side, I discovered that as well, some of her great-grandparents who had come from Ireland had belonged to lodges in Ontario, and a distant cousin belonged to the Ladies' Lodge called the Ladies' Orange Benevolent Association. And when she moved out to Saskatchewan, she helped to found an orphanage that was originally a Protestant orphanage that was started up in Indian Head. It still exists. It's called Orange Homes. But at one time in Canada in the early 1900s, 1 in 4 Protestants belonged to the Orange Lodge. And originally these lodges were brought to Canada largely with the British military, a men's lodge that had organized in Armagh, Ireland, initially in the 1700s. And the first members of the lodge were also Masons. So they incorporated into the lodge ritual degrees similar to degrees that exist in the Masonic Lodge, except that the degrees in the Orange, it was focused on Protestants, were all based on stories from the Bible. So it's in more recent times, I've almost thought of this as a men's Bible club in terms of what it accomplished. And in doing research, many of the lodges, each lodge had a president, a secretary, and a chaplain. Lodge meetings began with scripture and a reading from the Bible, and quite commonly the chaplain was the local Methodist or Presbyterian or Anglican minister. And in many towns and villages, the lodge met before a hall was built in one of the Protestant churches. I've been drawn to do a book recently on a lodge in Nova Scotia, a lodge in Torbrook Mines, because through research in cemeteries, I also have done a lot of loyalist research, member of the United Empire Loyalist Association and active with that. I became aware of two rare stones in Nova Scotia side by side, two Orangemen, and nowhere else does this exist in Canada, possibly in the world, and they were both erected by their lodge, a lodge that hasn't existed now for almost 100 years. So this really intrigued me, and I did further investigation.
Okay. So the Orange Lodge was, like you said, similar to the Masons. It sounds like they sort of did away with some of the mysticism and other stuff of the Masons, was more focused on biblical teaching. And you mentioned the women's, it was the Orange Benevolent Society, was it?
That's right. The ladies, First Ladies Lodge, they followed the men, but they were an auxiliary to the men, except as I mentioned, the first Orange Lodge was set up in Ireland, and they grew in Ireland, and then they became incorporated into the British military, and there were Irish regiments in the British military, and that kind of exported the lodge all over the world, so that there became Orange Lodges in Australia, New Zealand, Bermuda, as well as Canada, former British colonies. And over time, the first lodges in Canada were set up in the early 1800s. Soon as the colonization began here, in Ontario, the Maritimes, Quebec, New Brunswick, they became the largest. But the ladies got started later in the late 1800s. The first lodge in Canada was in Hamilton. And as you might expect, again, it was a lady who, her parents were members of the Orange Lodge. Her father was an Orangeman. So she was interested in it. And initially it was this idea of Protestant biblical teaching again. They wanted to be able to educate youth in the Protestant religion. Then they started up a lodge in Hamilton, and then it kind of grew from there. And one of their primary focuses initially was on young children. And there grew from that junior lodges, just for children, again. And they were opposed at the beginning to, men are known for marching in parades, particularly in Northern Ireland, where it's been, unfortunately, in the past associated with violence. Well, the women didn't think that their role was to be on parade at all. So that she was opposed to marching in parades. That did change over time, because initially the parades were held as part of church services. They would parade from their lodge hall to the church for a church service. And then on the 12th of July, they would always commemorate, going back to Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne, where they believed that the victor, King William of Orange, led to a Protestant ascendancy and enlightenment period throughout Europe. William of Orange was originally from the Netherlands, a Protestant who was asked to come to England to take over the throne to defend the Protestant religion and faith at that time. And he just got embroiled in a battle in Ireland, but it was really a European conflict. That the Battle of Boyne was one incident in a larger conflict taking place at the time. Interestingly enough, James, who he was fighting against, was opposed by the Pope in Rome. The Pope had come out supporting William of Orange. A strange set of circumstances. Hard to understand it now, but that was the history at the time. And as well, there were soldiers fighting on both sides from other countries. It wasn't strictly, at the time, a religious thing. It was more kind of geopolitics and families and how that would all play out. But the Orange Lodges that developed in Ireland initially were largely in part due to a conflict that erupted over land and property, as a lot of things can be. And in County Armagh, the first members of the lodge were tenant farmers, not well-to-do people, but they were in conflict with other tenant farmers for scarce land. And this led to a conflict between the two groups. And the two groups, one group was Roman Catholic and the other was Protestant. After the conflict had happened, the men formed up this lodge, and the lodge spread throughout Ireland. I mean, it's now called the Grand Orange Lodge of Ireland, except most people would know it's mainly based in Northern Ireland. But at one time, their headquarters was in Dublin. And if you ever travel to Dublin, you can still go on a tour of the city and see the building that's plaqued that was the former headquarters of the Orange Lodge in Ireland. And there is actually still an active lodge in Dublin. It's associated with the university at Dublin. But in Canada, it kind of declined as its fortune in, I mentioned religion, there were three real elements in Canada developed. One was Protestantism. The second was support for the crown, so long as the crown supported the Protestant faith. And the third was the British heritage associated with going right back to early British Constitution and British laws that were viewed as being beneficial. So over time, after the First World War, a lot of members from lodges joined up in the First World War, and then in the Second, higher percentages of Orangemen than other Canadians did, and suffered as a result of it, and it caused many lodges even to close from that incident. But as Canada has become a more diverse country and different views on religion, and I read an interesting study I wasn't aware of, but as long ago as 1960, more than half of Canadians didn't declare themselves in the Statistics Canada as Christians. So if more than 50 years ago, half of Canadians weren't Christians, and then if you divide out of that the percentage that were actually Protestants, and then you think that, well, see, one of the qualifications to apply to become a member of a lodge is you have to say you're a Protestant. So, and then not only that, but you have to not only be interested in Protestant, but you'd have to be interested in the monarchy, and you'd have to be interested in British heritage. So as those things have all become less important in Canada, so has the Orange Lodge. So that the Orange Lodge dwindled down to the point where one Grand Master back in the 1970s, Leslie Saunders, who's some viewed as the one of the most significant Grand Masters, he went on to become, they have a larger Grand Lodge Association for the whole world. He became president of that. He indicated in 1972 or 73 that he said that in Canada, the Orange Lodge had gone the way of the dodo bird. So now it's really interesting, though, to look back as part of our history to see what was the impact in terms of communities, and at a very different time, men, as with now we have, but to lesser degree, the Kiwanis Club, the Lions Club, there's the Knights of Columbus. All of these had an impact on men, and they were a reflection of people's thinking. At one time in Nova Scotia, you had over 100 lodges, from Yarmouth all the way to Louisburg, and areas in between. It was most strong in Cape Breton, the mining areas, and also in Colchester County. So and you can find gravestones and headstones throughout the province with orange symbols on them. But it's very unique to find, and I'm not aware of any other in the province that were put up by the lodge itself. And here in one location in Torbrook Mines, you have two side by side for one lodge.
So you mentioned lodge symbols. So if I was out looking at gravestones, which I've been known to do, what symbols would I be looking for if I wanted to see that might indicate that that who's lying there was a member of the lodge?
The most common one is the number 2.5. 2.5 goes back to the Bible, the 2.5 tribes that led the Israelites to safety across the river. And that's part of one of the degrees that Orange members learn when they go through their rituals. When an Orange member is first admitted, they spend a lot of time in lodge really bringing in members, or they did, and cycling them through. So that meetings there's a business portion to a meeting, but then the next portion of the meeting might be putting on the degree. So they put on the first degree, which is called the Orange degree. And it involves memory work, very much like Masonic Lodge, where different members of the lodge have a different role to play out that describes a story from the Bible. Brian, I was looking at online for some, I think it was in Ontario, for census information, and where they described their religion, and whether it was Roman Catholic or Presbyterian or Methodist. Well, I came across this one who'd marked his religion down as Orangeman. Orangeman, that was his religion. Now, this was from the early 1900s in rural Ontario. That's how strongly he viewed what he was doing in lodge. And I know it's not the same maybe, but in some families years ago, it's the same idea when you go through cemeteries and you'll see a lot of Masonic symbols. The orange symbol represents the same thing, that for these men, that was a part of their life. That's how they identified them. They not just identify themselves in terms of who their family was, who their parents, who their children, but their faith or their religion and the lodge that they belong to.
And this particular lodge in Torbrook, where you found the stones, tell me a little bit about that and what you found out about that.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. Maybe these two stones are side by side, and this cemetery, interestingly enough, is a historic cemetery. It had received designated historic status. The father of one Canadian Prime Minister is there, and one of the stones is to a young man, James Ackles, who tragically was killed in a mining accident. And it reads on it, erected by the members of Loyal Orange Lodge number 1624 to the memory of Brother James Eccles of the above lodge, who was accidentally killed in Torbrook iron mines on the 7th of April, 1894, age 23 years. He was a man loyal and true. That's where I got the title for this book, Loyal and True. And it makes you think about, what does loyal and true mean? Well, there was a popular Orange folk song, which I call the Protestant Boys. You might have heard of the verse before, but it starts out, the Protestant boys are loyal and true, stout-hearted in battle and stout-handed too. The Protestant boys are true to the last, and faithful and peaceful when danger has passed. And oh, they bear and proudly wear the colors that floated o'er many a fray, where cannon were flashing and sabers were clashing, the Protestant boys still carried the day. So it just a part of Irish folklore. But beside that stone is another stone, another headstone to this fellow member of that lodge. It's to William Nowland. It reads, "Sacred to the memory of William Nowland, late County Master of Annapolis County, Loyal Orange Association, died February 26, 1896, age 59 years, erected by his brother Orangeman as a tribute of respect and esteem." So, and as I mentioned, that cemetery also has the grave of Reverend Charles Tupper, who was father of Sir Charles Tupper, and Tupper was Prime Minister of Canada in 1896, but also Premier of Nova Scotia from 1864 to 1867. So a lot of interesting gravestones in that cemetery, and they have, in the summertime, COVID has interfered with that, but they do put on tours, and in the evening, they have members of the congregation and other volunteers dress up and act out. People will study the lives of past members of the church. There used to be a Baptist church near there, or the lives of people that are interred in the ground there now, and try to dress up and act out the person who they believe is buried there, and some part of their life history, some part of who they were at that time. So,
Okay. That's I find that really fascinating, especially about Charles Tupper, because I had recently, while in exploring graves over here in PI, found that Charles Tupper Sr., who was buried in Torbrook, he was the first called minister of the church just down the road from me, which was a church. What the community was originally. United Empire Loyalists. In fact, there's two graveyards in the community, one for the Baptist church and one for the Methodist church that specifically are designated where Empire Loyalists are buried. So yeah, that's so. Do they act out these men like James Eccles when they do the reenactment?
that hasn't happened yet. Okay. They haven't. They've been dealing with more. I mean, what's uppermost or popular nowadays. Unfortunately, years before vaccine, there are a lot of young children, that disease, and so one of the ones they act out is a girl who lost her life tragically. They also do Tupper, the minister, characters that have a broader understanding and appeal. In order to do an Orangeman, I think there first have to be a kind of an introductory explanation as to who this was and why he was here, and the lodge in that area. See, one of the things that's always thrown out with Orange Lodge is, well, they're anti-Catholic, but the Orange Lodge members, they prefer to think of themselves as pro-Protestant. And in that circumstance, you see, and in a lot of places where there were Orange Lodges, you kind of would wonder, well, how could they be anti-Catholic? Because there were no Catholics in that part of the country. And the same thing existed at this time around Torbrook Mines. There were no Catholics. It was all Protestants, you see. How the lodge started up there, I believe, was it started up when they discovered iron ore in there. And they brought in a lot of men from away. And in particular, there were some who came over from the Londonderry area, Nova Scotia, where they already had some facilities and where they were actually using the iron ore. In bringing in these men who some of them may have already belonged to another Orange Lodge. A lot of them were single men. What are they going to do with their time at night? A lodge got started up, and then it's hard for us to think about it now, but at that time in the late 1800s, early 1900s, religion was a lot more in people's minds, and it was, and the church was, and Baptist and Presbyterian and even Anglican church ministers were a lot more strident in trying to get their message out. And another way they could do this was to become a chaplain in an Orange Lodge like this. In fact, in Nova Scotia, they had an organizer of the Orange Lodge in the 1920s who went throughout the province. And his name was Edgar Morris, Reverend Edgar Morris, and he was also the Anglican minister for churches around, in Ontario and in Quebec, Stellarton, Nova Scotia, and he became the rector of St. Matthias Church in Halifax. In fact, he went on to become the president of the Dominion Protestant League across all of Canada, which was equivalent, kind of a union of Protestant churches. And at the same time, he was the organizer, which what meant his responsibility was to start up new Orange Lodges throughout Nova Scotia. So you can see clearly it was heavily religious based and not really very much focused on what happened in Ireland in the Battle of the Point. It was more on getting the message out. And I think as well here with this lodge in particular in Torbrook Mines, the name they picked, they chose for their lodge was Spurgeon. And Spurgeon was a very famous Baptist preacher in England. He was called the Prince of Preachers. Yep. That's right, because he spoke. I've read some of his sermons, and all of his sermons he wrote them down and he distributed them, over 6,000 sermons, and he was known as a plain speaker, and he appealed directly to the people. That's, I think, what appealed to these Orange Lodge members as well. They were trying to understand more about this Protestant faith and what the secrets of it were, and the Bible and everything else. And he was putting it in layman's easy to understand language for them, having probably read some of his sermons. Yeah, but it's interesting though, because you do see lodges, and looking at some of the, as I mentioned earlier, there were over 100 lodges at one time. Well, some of these lodges did take names from Ireland, like Enniskillen, which is the name of a community in line, or Sisters of Ulster, and Ulster's a province in Ireland. So they were directly making that connection. And those lodges were founded, I think, partly too by immigrants who came over from Ireland. This lodge here in Torbrook Mines was more than likely second and third generation Canadians. And their focus was really on doing something in the evening and at night and learning more, and they were influenced and led in that by the local church. And then as the mines declined there and closed, that's when this lodge also closed in the early 1920s. So, but it's so interesting though for me to have found those headstones, which don't exist anywhere else in the province, erected by a lodge. And at that time, side by side, nowhere else in Canada do you find two like that. So their spirit of, I don't know if brotherhood you want to call it at that time, they must have had a strong sense of a group as a lodge at that time. For a short number of years, a few decades, the tight community closeness of them, in what they believed they were doing. They did have a county lodge in Annapolis, like throughout the province. They also were organized into counties. And so they'd have county meetings as well as local meetings. And they'd choose at their lodge, each lodge would choose a couple of nominees to go to the county meeting every year. And then they would organize, I mentioned that they would celebrate the 12th of July. Well, they used to hold other events before Christmas and at neighboring lodges, social events. There was a lodge in Middleton that the lodge in Torbrook Mines was fairly close to. And some of those activities I was able to find through looking at old newspapers. So in addition to the public archives in Halifax has many of the reports and old records of the former Orange Lodges in Nova Scotia. This is the same case for most provinces. If anyone who has had or is interested in learning about the history of an Orange Lodge, whether you might have had a grandfather or a relative who might have been a member, you may not be able to find that member's name because unfortunately, very few members' lists exist. What you will find though, if that member was ever held in office, like a secretary of a lodge or a master of a lodge or a treasurer of a lodge, then you do have a good chance of finding his name because those names occur in the old reports. So I was able to look through the records in Halifax, the public archives, and they have records there for men's as well as ladies' lodges. One of the past mistresses in Nova Scotia went on to become the Mistress of Canada. And all of her personal papers she donated to the public archives, which if anyone was interested in looking or learning more about that, it's very interesting.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there's not much information online historical. Yeah, you have to actually find the time to be able to go to the public archives. And looking through old newspapers, I was focused on the newspapers for Torbrook that covered that area. And in those days, all of the local clubs like the Masons, the Oddfellows, and the Orange Lodge put reports in the paper, and reports of whatever happened at the meeting, who was there and what they did, if they were given a little present or an award, and if the ladies served tea afterwards or when the next meeting was. So I was able to identify through the records and the reports 23 past members of this lodge in Torbrook Mines. And I list them in the book, as well as some of them were buried in other cemeteries around that area. In the United Church Cemetery, there are quite a few buried. I did find one McConnell, no relation to me that I'm aware of, but there was a Samuel McConnell. So, but he actually died almost 100 years ago, 1922. So you never know when you go down these holes what you're going to come up with. But I found it to be interesting, and I wanted to do something like that too, just because people ask me sometimes because I make mention of a headstone that I noticed that is an Orangeman's headstone, then they'll ask me for, well, I knew somebody that was involved, my wife's brother or something, or my wife's great uncle or something. I think he was a member of it. Well, what was that about? And like a lot of things that in the past that were popular, like the Foresters is another lodge that used to be around, that's kind of disappeared. Canada is not just Canada, but other countries, many changes over time. This is a change in Canada.
So what did they do besides their meetings? Like if you were to explain to somebody about them, what did they do besides just their own biblical education and gathering together and marching on the 12th of July? What type of things were they involved in the community?
Well, I think they began in outreach for their own members, like supporting their own members with food, and they established an insurance fund, Orange Insurance, that still exists to this day, but it expanded out from their membership to anyone can get Orange Insurance now, life insurance, health insurance for their members. Then in the 1920s throughout Canada, at that time, probably due to the economic hardship, and there were many orphans and young children, they established orphanages in almost every province. There was one in New Brunswick, Quebec, and in Nova Scotia, the Orange Lodges, the men as well as the ladies, established one at Bible Hill. These were totally funded by the Orange members. Each Orange Lodge took up collection to pay for initially for the purchase of the land, then the building itself, and then every year for the manager and the couple that were there, and then the foodstuffs for the children. So that was a tremendous undertaking to take that on.
Was that because, on the Catholic side, when you talked about the divide, Catholic and Protestant, the Catholic churches ran their orphanages as their churches, and they had, and where so many different denominations, even there wasn't an organized, as much organized for, or able to, for some of these bigger tasks. I want to say, like I always say, Canada used to have the greatest social safety net. They used to have the church. They used to do all these things. We depend on the government now, or churchgoers that would provide for the fatherless and the widow. Is it sort of that drove them to do it, or is that one of the things because there wasn't any other Protestant organization doing it as much?
Well, the thing about the Orange Lodge was you could be a member of any church, so it was kind of an umbrella organization for Methodists and Anglicans, but I think it comes from their religious, biblical idea about helping others, and not to sound too naive about this, but I think that was largely the intention, and the ladies took a large role in this too.
I guess I understood that. I was just thinking that because they're like you said, they could be members of any of the Protestant denominations, just where there was multiple little denominations, or so it gave them a greater benefit to be able to do it all, to come together and do it. And
and then you see over time the government took over most of these orphanages, the changes in laws, and the lodge at the same time, these Orange Lodges started to decline, so they didn't have the financial capability to support these homes in many cases. But they did also then start to become more community focused in terms of support and raising funds for not just Protestant groups, but for the community they lived in, or the province, or even the country. Like they'd raise funds and donate it to the local hospitals, and everyone would benefit from it, or to Easter Seal or United Way. Sometimes it really just was up to each individual lodge, because the lodges ran themselves independently, so any member could propose something, and if he could get enough support within the lodge, then the lodge would be off fundraising to try to raise money for that project. It could be even something like a relative of his had developed a health issue, and he wanted to help out, and thought maybe he could encourage his lodge to get behind him and do that. And then other things, I think, in the community, if they were building a new baseball field, and the kids all needed, equipment or that type of thing, that the juniors that they had, the junior Orange Lodges and the Orange Young Britons, they sponsored baseball games, sometimes community games, and years ago there was not Mickey Mantle, but back in the 30s, some of the American baseball players were encouraged to come to Canada on tours, and I remember reading that in Westville, Nova Scotia, the Orange Young Britons there hosted a baseball game And there were pro players there from the US to try to, encourage the community to come out as well. So over time, and then they even became, as part of the requirements to become an Orangeman, you were supposed to be a Protestant. Well, that even got eased off. You were supposed to be a Protestant, but you could be married to a Roman Catholic. Your whole family didn't have to be Protestant. So I'm talking about Canada, and different. And I read an article where 30 years ago in New Brunswick, they were getting very upset with the loss of their members there, and they were blaming it, like the media was, on events in Northern Ireland and bombs going off there, and people associating that with a religious conflict, and the Orangemen must be part of it. And the Orange Lodge in New Brunswick even went so far as to suggest that there should be no more parades because we're losing members. That different areas had different focus. In New Brunswick, they changed from having parades to having picnics on the 12th of July, because that's what their members felt. They were still observing the day, and it was in terms of what the community really could understand and appreciate. It's hard to generalize with the Orange Lodge, because just as Canada is diverse, and differences between the West and the East, I think that the Orange Lodge in Canada was different too. The Orange Lodge in Newfoundland was originally started, oddly enough, by some Orangemen who went there from Nova Scotia to help it get going. Like in Newfoundland, it got started quite late, and you see, there aren't any. Most of the Orange Lodge members there had no connection to Ireland whatsoever. The Irish in Newfoundland were Catholic, not Protestant. So the Orange members there were all largely English in their background, some Scottish, but it went over extremely well in these outports. And again, here it's the idea, the outports all along the fishing outports all around Newfoundland. Well, it wasn't, again, an anti-Catholic thing, because most of these little outports, there was only one church and one religion, and it was something for the men to do, and it really took off because there wasn't television in those days, and maybe not that many of them had the ability to even get books and read or do something else. So the Orange Lodge became something that to the point that even, Joey Smallwood, the father of Confederation from Newfoundland, they talk about him. He was member of the Orange Lodge in St. John's. The last father of Confederation to have been an Orangeman, I guess, was him. So, and he wasn't the first. His father his father was a member, and his son was a member. So it's hard to really generalize about Orange Lodges. The experience in different parts of the country, I think, has reflected the community that the people are living in. The only underlying thing, it seems fair to say, is they were focused on, at that time, what they believed to be the Protestant faith and how it could fit into their life and be beneficial to them. And to a varying degree, they also all supported British heritage. In Newfoundland, it was the last province really to break off its colonial ties. So a lot of the English there would have felt, and having served, with the British in the First World War and in other empire wars before that, I'm sure, this would have been part of their family tradition to be loyal to the monarchy and the British heritage.
So, it sounds like they actually had quite a big impact on communities and societies, and they continued to do what they could as they declined. But I know, like you said, the orphanages and hospitals and different things that they were responsible for, even as you mentioned, their active service in the First and Second World War. So it does seem like there's having the the Orangemen was definitely a positive impact on the community, and it's something that if we're finding out about our ancestors or finding out about where they lived, that it's it's something they should be proud of, and not just think, like you said, people associated within the religious wars or conflicts in Ireland, but it was more about the actual benefit that they had
I think
on our country.
I think you're right, Brian. It's as with anything, though. You have to. I mean, there's good and bad in everything, and you have to until you know the facts. And I mean, my grandfather actually came to Canada as a result of that conflict in Ireland. But after he arrived in Toronto, he had trained as a garage mechanic, and he was also a veteran of the First World War. And he kept his lodge membership, and then he went to Northern Ontario, and where he also had a garage, and he belonged to the Kiwanis Club up there as well, and joined town council, and he was very civic minded. He became mayor of this little town in Northern Ontario. We used to worry about him because when he used to come and visit us, and at the time we lived in Southern Ontario, he would pick up hitchhikers on the road, and he only had one eye. He'd lost one of his eyes in World War I as well. Plus he had shrapnel to the stomach and down one leg. He wasn't in the greatest of health. And here he is picking up hitchhikers on the road, just because it was somebody that was in need. And then when my father was executor of his estate, and he called my dad in. He'd had one heart attack before he passed away, and he wasn't well. And we went up to see him, and he gave my dad 2 lists. He said, in the will, after you sell everything off, the people that owed the garage money, that owed the car dealership money, he'd given them a list of names for people that could afford to pay. And he said, those people, that's all right. You can go to collect from them, but these others, just let them go. They're having a hard time of it. So I don't want you to try to collect the money from them. So, and he used to teach Sunday school lessons in the Presbyterian church in this little town. So I think it was part of who he was. Like nowadays, if I was asked, and most people were asked how they'd identify themselves, I'd probably do it in terms of, a father, a husband, this is who my parents were, and, I'm a Canadian. But I think years ago, in my grandparents' generation, I think their faith, their religion was also very important to them. And that channeled all of their decisions.
Yeah. It seems like as much as religion and faith sometimes in modern context is seen as a negative, there's definitely a positive there in there. Imagine if there was more people like your grandfather, and that's what they thought when they went to the grave of, though I'm owed a debt by this person, that willingness to forgive it and know who like that needed the help, or like you said, picking up hitchhikers just because he thought it was a person in need that needed something. And it's not something that comes naturally to people nowadays, that they necessarily think of others. So there was more Orangemen still out there in our communities now, and people who put those thoughts ahead, we might be a little better off in our day and age, and a little better towards treating each other as Canadians and as humans, just in a better context.
Well, it goes both ways, though, because the biggest example of that is, and the most prominent Orangeman was Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, was also an Orangeman who came from Scotland. And some people believe that the whole idea of Confederation, you see, prior to Confederation, there was something called the Grand Orange Lodge of British America, and it was divided into jurisdictions. Those jurisdictions and the way they were set up underneath them as counties, and then provinces, and then counties, was what he ended up envisioning for Canada. The provincial setup that came into play with Confederation followed what had already been set up by this Orange Association. So, but as we know, I mean, some people don't view everything he did in today's light as acceptable. You know, he was involved, unfortunately, with residential schools and some other matters that cause a lot of pain to people. So and I'm sure my grandfather, as much as, you know, the stories I tell about him, there are probably other stories that he seemed, you know, like when my dad and his brother used to get into arguments, my grandfather had two pair of boxing gloves, and he used to push them downstairs into the basin to settle it, you know. And my dad said that he always was afraid of that because his brother, who was 2 years older than him, weighed about 50 pounds heavier than him too. So my dad knew that if he tripped or fell down and Bill got on top of him, he'd be in trouble. It wasn't a fair contest, and probably not the real way to settle disputes.
So,
but funny.
So it probably did help your father to know what's the right fight to pick, I guess, sometimes, because he knew the consequences.
Right.
But no, you all know you're right. And then again, you know, it's not everything is necessarily positive, but just even just those positive things, and, you know, thinking about our country and our nation as a whole, and actually caring for it. Whether some people, much like parents or grandparents, might not have cared, you know, in our context, what was best, but I bet you your grandfather thought he was doing what was right by them to make them there. So yeah, no, it was really interesting. I'm glad you wrote this, and I'm glad to have had the time to talk to you a little bit about the Orangemen. So just on the last thing, so if I'm discovering Orangemen in my family tree, I've gone and I've come across maybe some of these symbols. So you mentioned the public archives. Is there other sources, other books that have been written as well that might document some of these different lodges or groups throughout Canada? Or
well, there was a book written initially back in the 80s by two college professors, Houston and Smith, called The Sash Canada War. It was published by University of Toronto. Both of them were from Ireland, not from Northern Ireland, and they were doing time here at Canadian universities. It's a tremendous introduction. It's a kind of a historical, sociological, geopolitical study of the Orange Lodges right across Canada, and refers to their strengths and weaknesses and what happened to them, how they grew, how they passed out, all of that. Since that, there really haven't been books published until my interest in it. And prior to this book, as I mentioned, we have as part of the Loyal Orange Association, you have the Men's Lodge, called shortened to the LOL, Loyal Orange Lodges. You have the Ladies Lodges, which is the Ladies Orange Benevolent Association, the LOBA. You had the Youth Lodges, Orange Young Britons, OYB. As with the Masonic members, after they've obtained their degrees, can go on, if they so desire, and become Shriners. The only qualification to be a Shriner is you have to be a Mason first. The Orange Lodges became affiliated with what's called the Royal Black Preceptory and Royal Black Knights. It is more religious even than the Orange Lodge, and within it are 11 degrees. The 11th degree is called the Red Cross, and it's associated with Easter. This is another symbol that appears on gravestones sometimes of Orange members if they were on their headstone, if they're a member of the Orange Lodge and went on to become a member of a Black Lodge, you'll find both the 2.5 on the left-hand side, and on the right side, you'll find a cross. Now, you might think at first, well, they're just religious or something, but you'll see that cross, and sometimes you'll see a number beside it. The number will be the number of the preceptory that they belong to. I found that a couple of times for lodges in Nova Scotia. Well, before I found these headstones, a year before I found these headstones, I found another headstone in Londonderry, in the cemetery in Londonderry, and it's the only one, oddly enough. There's something about headstones and me finding them, and it was erected by a Black preceptory to one of their members in Londonderry. And it's a massive stone. In fact, I did an article on it for History Nova Scotia, Historic Nova Scotia, and it's on the internet. I've done 5 articles for them, historical articles. I also did an article for them on the monument in Sydney to the veterans of the war, First and Second World War, who were members of the Orange Lodge in Cape Breton County. When I was in Sydney, and I lived in Sydney for a year as a college student, well, after college articling, and I was never even aware of this monument. My apartment was right around the corner from it. But later, visiting back there with family, I came upon this and discovered what it was, and no one else really knew anything about it. So I researched it and took pictures of it and put that on the internet. But coming back to the Royal Black Knights, I discovered that my grandfather, if you were serious about the Orange Lodge, the more I read about it, I thought, well, he likely became a knight as well. And I was able to find the record for that. He belonged to a lodge in Northern Ontario and a preceptory there. So then I did more research on the Black Knights, and I published a book on the Royal Black Knights. And it lists the lodges in Nova Scotia and across Canada for all of the preceptories that were started up. Now, there weren't as many preceptories and Black Knights, obviously, as there were Orangemen, because not everybody who joined an Orange Lodge was that interested in going on. But so that's part of the Orange family that exists out there. And then further in my genealogy, I mentioned, I think I had a cousin who was active in the ladies in Saskatchewan, and she helped to found the Orange Home for Protestant Youth, now for all orphans, which is in Indian Head. I discovered that she never married. She went to business college and managed an apartment building in Regina and became active in the ladies' lodge there, became Grand Mistress for the whole province of all the Orange Lodges. So that got me interested. I knew nothing really about the Orange Lodges for the ladies. I researched that and published another book on the LOBA.
Okay.
So I've done the Black, the LOBA, and now this book on the Orange. And those are the only other published books. I think it's because if you're not a university professor, maybe you don't really have the interest in this. My interest, again, initially was this family connection. And then when I was in school, before I went on to a career in law, my first degree was in history. So I had that background in historical interest. But I mean, I still run up against it, you know, and I know I've written articles about the United Empire Loyalists, and that's fine, although some people aren't keen on that either because they associate United Empire Loyalists with British and colonialism, and that's all kind of not the greatest. But it's the same thing with the Orange Lodge. I've run into some people who, oh yeah, my grandfather was in the Orange Lodge, and then I find out that their grandfather was in the Orange Lodge too, but please don't mention that to anyone, you know, because it's this idea again that they were anti what's acceptable. And you don't want to have your own name associated with something that's anti-unacceptable. So, but I try to take the broader view here that there's good and bad in everyone and everything. And the Orange Lodges, as I mentioned, in Canada, went the way of the dodo bird many years ago. My main interest here is historical, and just trying to, became involved by trying to learn more about it. I don't live in Northern Ireland, and I can't comment on the situation in Northern Ireland.
No.
So, but yeah, if anyone else is interested, I can send you the links, Brian, but I also have other books that are available. I've published a total of 9 books now. 4 of them are on United Empire Loyalists. 1 is on the Ulster Scots, and the others are on the Orange, and all of them were initiated by my own genealogical research and in being able to find, and I was very fortunate to find some of the records I did. I had one lady who found out when I was researching about the Ladies' Lodge. She was the niece of a former Grand Mistress of Canada. She sent me her mother's files, and that was really helpful. And so I did a book just entitled The Grand Mistress about her. She also sent me her mother's regalia, like her collar, and I took pictures of it, and I include those in the book for others to see and enjoy. I've had some people contact me, some women in North Sydney in Nova Scotia, and Sydney itself were particularly strong in the Orange, perhaps at one time stronger than anywhere else in Nova Scotia. And in part, I think it went back to the number of men who were called in there into industrial Cape Breton for work in the mining. And there were supervisors who came from away, from Toronto and Scotland and England, and some of those supervisors already had a lodge experience. And when they got there, they were looking for something to do, and they put themselves into the lodge and encouraged others. But a different time in Canada's history.
It is, and it's it's amazing just to find out these things. And I find it's useful because it puts our history in context, especially when you can make that personal connection like you did. It makes you kind of appreciate our own history and the communities and the people that came before us, the good and the bad, of what's been what's transpired. So again, thank you very much. I appreciate talking to you today.
Thank you, Brian.
So I'm wanting to invite you back in 2 weeks' time for another edition of How We Got Here. Like I said, I'm going to be mixing up a little this year. My next episode, I'm actually going to talk a little about my own family, and I'm going to build upon what we talked about with Brian. I'm going to talk about how, though my family were members of the Orange Lodge, well, not the ones I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to be talking about a connection that my family has to them, and some of the benevolent work that they had done in Atlantic Canada. So join me in 2 weeks, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, How We Got Here Genealogy, as I'll be posting some new videos there very shortly. And again, join me in 2 weeks. I'm looking forward to it. And you have a wonderful day. Keep searching for your family and keep making those connections.
Thank you for listening to this episode of How We Got Here. Make sure you check out the show notes for more information about today's topic and guests. How We Got Here is hosted and produced by Brian Nash. Title music from Tribute to O'Carolyn by Luna Bajowski.